Welcome to Helping Organisations Thrive. Today I have the pleasure of Ian Moore on the show. Good morning to you, Ian.
Morning, Julian. Nice to be back on your podcast again.
Yes, well, it's great having you on because you are our sponsor as well. So it's always great to have you on at the show as well to sort of show what you do as a business. You are the MD and founder of Logicort, and you help SMEs with their HR support through tailored retained packages. And there's a lot more to that. So people need to engage with you to understand a bit more what you do. So today we're going to be exploring something quite, I think, really pertinent at this time of year. We're heading into Christmas, into the new year, and a lot of companies do a lot of performance management. So we're exploring performance management and why this is relevant in today's workplace. And so the first one, I suppose, for me, is if you could provide as almost a brief overview of the importance of performance management in today's workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. As you rightly say, this is the time of year where it's that dreaded moment from a manager or from an employee of we've got to go through the pain of the performance management process because it's year end. We want to review where you are, and it can be quite an onerous process, and that in some respects. But actually, if you peel it back a little bit, it shouldn't actually be onerous at all. It should just be something that is part of your DNA of your business, whatever size it is, and however many people you employ. And it should be much more about whether you delivered your targets, but it's also having a conversation around understanding somebody's strengths, understanding areas of weakness, and helping to have that environment where people can thrive and not just be seen as a tick box HR process exercise that you've got to go through in order for you to either achieve your own objectives as a manager, because often that's part of one of your objectives is to conduct the performance management process, or even to get a financial reward for doing so. It should be more than that. It needs to be more around that culture and that environment that allows people to thrive. In terms of where it sits in people's psyche, it can be seen as very much one of those things that is just a tick box exercise, I've said, but it should be far more than that. It needs to be a collaborative conversation. And I think in today's environment, where there is lots more of remote working, there's less potential engagement with individuals and their teams, their line managers, this process will help ensure that people do have that engagement, do have that feedback, and have that sense of belonging, which is really important as well at the moment.
You mentioned the word pain, almost that sort of, it's like a painful time of year. It's a painful thing to do. How do we sort of change that, I suppose, mindset? Because already when people think of performance reviews, and I've done it for many years, and it feels like I've got to do this performance review, and it's like a massive task. It's overwhelming, and even the recipient is not always looking forward to it because of what people are going to say. So how do we change the mindset of the individuals involved, but also the culture of the business to see them as a much more positive thing in the business?
I think it just needs to be part of the day-to-day activities. There's many apps out there and online tools that collect information constantly, and they're all great. Whether they're good or bad for your business is a different conversation, but the premise is really key, because it's about having that discussion throughout the course of the year. It's about having the engagement, having the discussion, collecting the evidence as you go, so that when you get to the end of the year, you don't have that oh my goodness moment, I've got to do this, but all I want to do is go out because I've got my Christmas holidays coming or whatever. It should just be something that you just sort of go through in a relatively easy manner. So collecting the information, collecting the conversations, having those discussions throughout the course of the year, making it part of your management style, making it part of your standard working processes, just makes that end of year conversation so much more straightforward and streamlined, but equally no surprises. And I think that's part of the key thing as well, is to make sure that you get to that point, whether it's at the end of December or whether it's the end of your financial year, that you just have a conversation with somebody with no surprises. So, and if there is a surprise, then as a leader, you've not been doing your role through the course of the last couple of months because you've not given that feedback. So to embed it, which is, I guess, what we're trying to say, it just needs to be part of the conversation, and just same as yourself, I used to dread this time of year doing a number of reviews because you'd run out of time in your diary, you'd be trying to finish doing other stuff for year end perhaps, and you'd be feeling you're squeezing it in. Whereas if you're doing that holistic, it's part of my day-to-day thought process, then actually it just flows, and you don't need to put any effort in. And I mean that not literally, because you should put effort into any conversation with an individual about performance, but you don't need to be putting days and days of information and gathering, collecting data, whatever it might be, to have that conversation, because it should just be all there for you.
So how do we facilitate that? Because I agree with you, is that it shouldn't be just once a year you talk about some performance. How do we facilitate it? And what have you done in your own experience of where you've done this more regular stuff, and how does that play out? How does that sort of show itself up in a sort of in a business? I mean, an example yourself, I guess.
Yeah, and I think like all good things, whenever we talk about embedding stuff into businesses, it has to come from the top. There has to be that value that the individuals see, and that it's bought into by the leadership team or the MD or whoever it may be. So it needs to be driven from the top, and to embed it, it has to be valid, and it has to be appropriate for the business that you've got. So what I've seen in my experience is that a lot of organizations have a very structured approach. You have a form, you've got to fill it out, you've got to go through all these steps and sign it 34,000 times, send it off and never be seen again, through to those who basically just have a conversation on a regular basis. And that often, for some types of businesses, works better because it's informal, it's engaging. You still need a record of it in some way, shape or form, so that you can celebrate the success, but also address any areas of concern. So there's still a level of documentation, but it needs to be appropriate for what you're doing. So in our experience, and certainly when I was managing large teams, it was very much around have a conversation and ensure that you have that two-way feedback, but not make it onerous. And then the final piece has to be the person sitting next to you having that discussion and informing them about their performance has to believe and has to know that it's going to have some value to them going forward. So there's no point having a conversation if the individual doesn't see the benefit of the process, and that's quite key as well.
Yeah, I think my latter career, I ended up, it was almost like quite regularly one-to-ones with my team and even my own boss. The sort of performance was sort of done in a conversational, observations of things I need to work on were picked up and nipped in the bud at the time, which made it more relevant. And it almost became an ongoing conversation. And as you say, the year end, it's good to document things because it's important to do that. And I found that effective. I worked in one business, I had a performance review, and they said something was a surprise, and almost felt like, well, why didn't you tell me 6 months ago that came up? And it's like, I don't know, it's not helpful. You talked about sort of, performance management can help unlock sort of potential in the workforce. Could you sort of, I guess, elaborate on how that process facilitates unlocking people's potential?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, what the conversation has to be, it's not just about what have you done, it's about what do you want to do. So looking into the future rather than always looking retrospectively. And also, if you think about it, when people are hired, they talk about their aspirations, they talk about their experiences and what they've done before, and all this sort of stuff. So you get that rounded view of an individual. After a period of time, if you've changed line managers and this sort of stuff, a lot of that knowledge has gone, or understanding has gone, because it's not necessarily passed on. And you don't interview your team in the same way when you take a new team on as you would if you were recruiting somebody. So these discussions also an opportunity to talk about things that have happened and things that they believe they can bring to the role, but also talk about their aspirations, and whether or not there are things that they want to do or believe they can do based upon their past experience as well. That when you're planning for the future, you're looking at your organization, looking at your resourcing, looking at new initiatives, you go, oh, I forgot that Anne used to do this, but let's see whether that's something we can use her skills and experience for going forwards into this role. But equally, if someone has an aspiration to become a line manager or an aspiration to become more technical, these conversations can tease that out, and therefore you can put some training plans in place to actually unlock that potential. And sometimes it can also be things that people are doing outside of work that can unlock some potential as well that you're unaware of. So these conversations should be far more overarching than just saying these are the list of objectives you set this year, this is how you've done against them. It needs to be far more about the how have you done stuff, and why have you done things, and what else can you do, rather than just the how in that sense. So having those bigger conversations and opening up a little bit, I think adds value. If you go back to what we were talking about before, where the individual needs to see some benefit from this process, then having that and bigger understanding of an individual, they get a sense of engagement, sense of belonging. They're buying into what you're trying to do, perhaps as a business, and therefore going to be more engaged going forwards. But I do think there's a key thing that I would like to say as well, that I think is really important. I've always done this, is that when you go through this process, the last question or the last topic we always used to talk about is, we've just spent this last period of time talking about you. Now you give me some feedback. And that's really important as well, so that the individual understands that it's not a one-way set of evaluation or feedback. It has to be two ways. And if you do the two-way stuff, not only as a leader do you learn more, but equally that individual, it changes the relationship somewhat. The individual can then give you that feedback from their perspective about what you do good and what you do perhaps not so well. So you can also alter yourself going forwards. And that, I think, is often lost in these processes, that it's very much a one-way street.
Yeah, no, I think it is always deemed as a one-way street. And almost I think people interviewing people can be the same. And I think approaching it almost like a learning opportunity for both of you sets a nice stage for something that can be really conducive and helpful for both, as you say. And I like the idea of asking your direct report, saying, how about me then? You give me some feedback on how I manage you, how I lead you, how I inspire you, all that sort of stuff. And hopefully you get some nuggets out of that, which would be helpful. I think the learning piece is important, as you say, rather than, oh, you hit this objective or you didn't hit the objective. It's almost, well, whether you hit it or not, what did you learn in that process? It's a really helpful thing. And I got to a place with performance management reviews where a third of the time was spent on historical, because it's important to review history and what's happened and what did you learn, and that reflection. And then the other 2/3 is about the future development, what's next, how can we get you sort of better, develop you, etc., just to sort of change the emphasis rather than just being all on the historical, and then 2 minutes at the end about, oh, how can we develop you. Now with the sort of changing landscape of work in the last few years, obviously with remote hybrid work sort of places, people with different sort of setups, how has performance management sort of adapted to meet the needs of this sort of dynamic workplace, or what do we need to do to be different in that context?
That's a great question. I think it has changed it dramatically. I think a lot of people have struggled with performance management for remote workers, in the sense of if I can't see them, how do I know what they're doing every day? And I think for a lot of leaders, that's been a real live challenge that they've had to address. I think the remote working piece has actually driven the need for a better performance management process than perhaps it would have been before, because you actually have to make the effort. And it sounds awful now I'm saying it out loud, but as with a remote workforce, you have to make more effort to engage with them potentially, and more effort to understand what they're doing than perhaps you would if they're in the office, because you're not observing them and you're not having that day-to-day feedback type of thing. Where I think a lot of people are struggling with performance management, certainly for that remote or hybrid, is being able to have enough examples or enough evidence to back up a viewpoint on whether that person's good, average, or poor. But but the smart organizations are doing that in that gathering of evidence, that gathering of feedback over a period of time, and therefore it all comes back fundamentally to having that regular dialogue. It therefore doesn't become an onerous task going forwards. It is part of that day-to-day stuff. So you're actually gathering it as you go, rather than trying to think of examples. And that's where some of these online tools have become really helpful, because you are able to gather that. You are able to gather feedback from peers, customers, other stakeholders, and put it into one place. So there's a lot of things around kudos now, where somebody, if they do a good job, the systems that you can give the kudos to that individual. All of that is really good, because it gives you real life examples, and certainly when people are remote, it just supports your feeling of whether that person is doing what they should be doing, and it's real, right? So it needs to be based on real evidence. I think the other part that people are struggling with this diverse workforce is consistency of approach. So if somebody who's in the office 4 days a week compared to somebody who may be in once or twice a week, or maybe twice a month, or whatever it might be, having the same level of knowledge of that individual, or those two individuals rather, can be quite difficult, because it's much easier, it's human nature, it's much easier to form an opinion of something you see regularly, or somebody you see regularly, than to form an opinion of something you don't see very often. But as a line manager, you need to step back and take a more holistic view, and that is a challenge to stop the preconceptions in your mind over, well, this person's doing really well because I see what they do every day, compared to the person I only see every so often. They can't possibly be doing the same sort of output, quality, whatever it might be. So you've got to uncheck that unconscious bias box in your head, perhaps, maybe a way of thinking about it. So presenteeism and all that sort of stuff. So it's so multi-layered. It's become more complicated, but actually, to some extent, by it being embedded as a conversation in your day-to-day work, it doesn't need to become any more complicated than a conversation. And that's perhaps where people don't always join up the dots, so to speak.
Yeah, you made some interesting points about that, people being in the office more than others. And there's that bias, unconscious bias, that you're observing and seeing the impact of somebody, and actually creates a more positive view. And there's a thing about that, isn't there? A whole piece about people tend to do better who are in the office more than who are not, and that awareness. How do we, I guess you talked about this gathering data ongoing and being objective. How do we do that in a day-to-day practical way? Because I'm all for the thing that, you're not measured by how long you do something, or what you do, how long you spend on time on something. It's all about the results.
Yeah.
But with performance management, the result obviously is important, because you might have an objective against it. To understand how people develop people, you need to understand how they did it as well, which is the important piece for a positive thing, and saying, actually, you could do this in a better way and get even better results. But it's more difficult in a remote context when you're not seeing it as a day-to-day. So how can we do this in a objective way and almost help us against that challenge of that unconscious bias where something we see every day and observing it.
Yeah, it's about having those multiple touch points to people, or that have interactions with that individual that you are assessing. So, it used to be very much around the 360-degree feedback. Everybody would be sent a form, and you'd fill it out, and you get a perspective on it. That is still valid, but I do think it's not that formality anymore. It is very much more around having the conversation in the same way as you do with the individual, but with the stakeholders on a regular basis. So it's not always about when things go badly wrong or whether there's an issue. It should just be, you're working with Julian a lot at the moment. Any feedback for me? A conversation as simple as that throughout the course of the year will give you those touch points as a line manager to actually understand the impact that individual's having, positive or negative, on the wider work, their stakeholders or their customers, whatever. So it's gathering that information and having the ability to reach out and talk to people. And it's on the conversation now, much more than it is filling out a form. So filling out a form, I think, is great to some extent because it's evidence and it's evidence-based and everything else. But you've got to have the conversation. You just can't send a blind form out to somebody, say, can you fill that in and give me your feedback? So creating that conversation on a regular basis also then helps you with your opinions and your perceptions of individuals throughout the course of the year, because it just allows you to have that more rounded perspective rather than it being a one-time hit. And that's fundamentally where I think it's changed now, of the one-time hit performance management process of many years ago. It is changing into being part of a continuum throughout the course of the year, but with specified review periods so that people have that in their diaries and in their mind's eye of what they're going to do. But I think the other part, which we haven't talked about, is the younger generation, in terms of those who are Generation Z and Generation X, excuse me, coming into the workplace, because their perceptions are very different to those who may be coming more up to retirement, that whole generation gap. And I know we've talked about that before, and you've talked about that on your podcast with other people, of how you need to address the needs of the new workforce compared to the older workforce, because everything is different. But what we see and what I found is actually having structure is really important, and that's what people like as much as they like to be agile. The new generation of employees coming in do like that level of structure. They like to understand what is acceptable and what isn't, and what you expect from them, because their social views are very different perhaps to my generation, or if you just keep going because that's what your boss wants type of thing, to you've asked me to do this, I'm going to do this for you, but I'm not going to do anything else. Very generalized statement, I appreciate that. But actually having that structure allows them to get the best out of them, because it sort of fits their social viewpoints, perhaps in some terms.
And how does that structure look? Because it's interesting, you make a valid point about looking at the different sort of generations and how we interact, and we need to adapt. How different would that be with the sort of Gen Z's type of generation in terms of that?
Yeah, I think it is around that immediateness. So whereas you referred to it earlier about you had a conversation with one of your bosses in the past, and it came as a bit of surprise of a feedback. That was typically the way in which it would work, is that you'd wait for a point in time to have that feedback. The Generation Zs and so forth, they're in the immediacy. They're in the here and the now. So they want to know now whether or not they're doing the right thing, they're performing correctly. So actually having the conversation on a regular basis feeds into their needs to actually have that immediate feedback, that immediate understanding of where they are, and not have it on a quarterly, half yearly, or an annual cycle, which perhaps is certainly where when I went into the working environment, that was how it worked. You didn't get much feedback until you got your review, and then warts and all will come out. So actually, their social viewpoints and their way in which they interact, actually, I think, has a benefit for everybody, because it's actually forcing businesses, or it should force businesses, to have that conversation on a far more regular basis, and that immediateness, if that's the right word, it is there for everybody to see, rather than it just being for that group of individuals.
There's almost this continuous, not continuous feedback, because you don't want to continually paralyze people with feedback, but a continuous conversation that's just flowing, and then at a point in time that you sort of set some time aside to review and document, and obviously look at sort of future developments. But as you say, and I like the idea of that 360 approach. Obviously, rather than doing a formal 360 sort of psychometric, it's almost getting that conversation with other people. What do you think of this person? How are they doing? How is it with that project? And just getting more holistic view, and bringing that as a evidence for positive, and actually enhancing them, and almost surprising them with, actually in a positive way, of actually, this is some good feedback for you for what people are saying. And I think that's really important in terms of sort of looking ahead now. And what do you see as future trends in performance management, and how we should organization prepare for that?
I think organizations are going to start moving away, perhaps, of using the performance management process and tying it so rigidly into a reward structure. So a lot of organizations will base the bonuses off a percentage of the bonus would be payable, perhaps, on how well you were in your performance management review. I think that's going to be becoming a little bit more detached to some extent, where you will get recognized in a different way for performing well in your role. I think where it will get to in the future will be far more around rewarding behavior on a more regular basis than it being a one-time hit. So, it may not necessarily be financial, but if you are performing well and you're consistently performing well, why wait for an annual review? If you're performing well over a period, well, you should be rewarded at that point, not rewarded at the end of it, type of thing. Because I think where a lot of performance management processes are is that you might have had a really fantastic first half of the year, but maybe not done so well in the second half of the year. So therefore, on average, you've been okay. So you don't really get rewarded for it. If you got rewarded for what you did well in the first half of the year at that point, the question I would always ask is that going to encourage that individual to perform well in the second half of the year, assuming everything is the same? And therefore, as an organization, you are getting a more engaged, productive individual for a longer period, because you've recognized their good performance at the time. Leaving it for a year and then averaging it out, I'm always skeptical about whether that's good or bad. I get why people have done it, and I understand that the mechanics behind it, but actually celebrating the here and now, I would argue, would allow people to then continue on that momentum, continue on that progression curve, and not necessarily take a dip. Yeah, people will take dips, get that. But maybe we need to think about it slightly differently. So I'm seeing organizations now who are using their performance discussions to recognize good performance at the time. And I think the analogy I'd say is that if you've got someone performing badly, most organizations address it then at that point. Maybe it's onto an improvement plan, maybe it's, it may end up in parting ways, whatever it might be. You don't really have the flip of that in the same way. You don't always have people who are doing really well having a recognition and the reward at the time. can often be left to the end of the year. So maybe we just need to flip it around a bit.
Yeah, you make a very good point, actually. As soon as there's some sort of bad performance, it has to be addressed usually quite quickly to get it sorted. But actually, when you see good performance, you should be actually encouraging it and thinking, okay, what else can this person do? Do you need more support? And it's not just about financial incentives here. It's about actually, we think this person's ready to sort of take the next level, add more stuff into their day, or in terms of responsibilities, I guess. And it's that ongoing sort of development, isn't it? So I think that's really helpful, actually. I think that'd be useful. Well, thank you for your conversation. Thank you for the insights, Ian, and that's really helpful in terms of making performance reviews a lot more interesting, but also positive both for the line manager and the direct report in terms of a positive conversation, but that ongoing piece to make sure it's an ongoing development piece, and it's not just about the one conversation a year where you have to fill a big form in, but to minimize it with a good conversation and then obviously document that. If people want to get in touch with you and connect with you and find a bit more about how you can help them with that, what's the best way of doing that, Ian?
So the website is lodgecourt.com. If you want to reach out directly, I'm obviously on LinkedIn. My email is ian@lodgecourt.com. I'd be delighted to talk to people and also get their views on performance management, because the more conversation we have over this about the good and the bad, and best practice and new ways of doing things, I think is really important as well. And then the only thing I'd also like to say is that you mentioned at the top of the podcast that we do support and sponsor this amazing podcast, which is one of our joys at the moment, to our dad. But as listeners to the podcast, we are offering an exclusive offer if you were to become a retained client of ours, that between now and the end of February 2024, can't really believe I'm saying 2024 already, but between now and the end of 2024, then you can get the first month of that retained support for free. So if you were to sign up, there's an offer exclusively for your listeners and your subscribers, we would be delighted to help them with their HR activities in whatever guise that they may need.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you for that great offer. And all the details will be in the show notes. There is a link there to connect with you, but also we'll make sure that offer is explicit as well in the show notes of this episode and going forward. Thank you for your time today.
You're welcome. Thank you, Julian. Pleasure as always to catch up with you.